Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Writers in Focus. I'm your host, James Taylor, and I'm delighted to have as my guest today, Kate Sweeney. May I call you Kate?
Yes, please do. It's great to be here.
Cut. Sorry, we've got to restart.
It's okay. Kate's been through this before. But on radio, no one sees it.
No, yeah, we do this all the time.
It happens all the time,
yes.
Right? Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Hi, welcome to Writers in Focus. I'm your host, James Taylor, and I'm delighted to have as my guest today, Kate Sweeney. May I call you Kate?
Please do.
I'd like to welcome you to the Atlanta Fulton Public Library and the Fulton County Government Center. By way of introduction, ladies and gentlemen, Kate Sweeney is a radio features producer and host and writer at Atlanta's own NPR station, WABE 90.1. She's won 3 Edward R. Murrow Awards for her work. Her writing has appeared in no less than the Oxford American, one of my favorite magazines, Atlanta Magazine, and New South. She has a terrific website. Just Google Kate Sweeney, American Afterlife, the book we're about to talk about, and you'll find a terrific blog and website. Let's begin by talking about the book. It's called American Afterlife, Encounters in the Customs of Mourning. Right. M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, published by the University of Georgia Press. I want you to do most of the talking, but if I read this book correctly, and I have, and I really loved it, I want everybody out there to go out and buy this book.
Oh my goodness, thank you.
The subtitle says it all. It's called Encounters in the Customs of Mourning. You've got basically 8 chapters, 12 vignettes about various encounters you've had around the nation with, call it American funereal customs. Do I have that right?
Right, yeah. The way I usually describe the book is it's stories of regular Americans who find themselves involved with death and memorialization. So everyone from the mother attending a roadside memorial for her 20-year-old daughter who died in a car accident.
We'll get to that.
To a third-generation funeral director, to a clutch of obit writers having a conference out in the New Mexico desert. And then we go back and look at how on earth we got here as a country, mainly toward our Victorian forebears, who are the folks who invented a lot of what we think of when it comes to memorialization.
This is your interview. I want people to read the book, but the book has struck me personally because I have reached that age where my friends and relatives are dying almost every month. Nothing prepares you for it. Even all the reading I've done, literature, poetry, Thomas Lynch and the Dismal Trade. What was your reaction? I mean, I've studied funereal customs around the world, and you go to wakes and funerals and cremations, and what got you involved in this? Because no one died yet in your life. Okay.
That is a really good question.
I didn't mean to pull that up, but I had to.
No, but that's exactly it.
What are you writing about this for?
Yeah, so I started writing this book when I was in my late 20s.
Okay.
And at first I just, in my mind, it was a matter of intellectual curiosity. I was it started out with this article about a green burial cemetery, which is ecologically friendly burial.
It means the body is biodegradable, and they don't put embalming. I didn't know that.
Exactly. So no embalming, no vaults, nothing that doesn't biodegrade completely.
Right. Which is a great way to go.
Yeah. So I was doing this feature story for Oxford American Magazine, as you say, and it just sort of snowballed from there. I was working on this story and I was learning all of this stuff about memorialization and death customs in this country. I hadn't known anything about this. And so it was just fascinating, and quickly I became, as I continued to write about this and write about other sort of topics in this area, I became a really good person at dinner parties.
Oh, yeah.
I could talk about all the costs that go into making a funeral.
Between the foie gras and the glass of wine, what do they do for embalming?
Right. Exactly. To jewelry made out of human hair that, the Victorians, folks back in the 1800s would make. But as you say, I had never experienced really catastrophic loss when I started this book. And I realized that I had to figure out why I was writing it in order to write it well. In fact, in order to have a point of view that was honest with the reader.
It's beautifully written.
You know what I mean? Like I couldn't come across as saying, "Oh, I'm a big expert here." And so I realized, sort of just as you say, a reason that I was writing it was simply that I was a newcomer in this territory, and part of it was that I didn't know anything about it, and I was nervous about what to expect when it does happen to me, because it happens to all of us. We all walk through that door eventually, and nobody tells us what to expect. And while nothing could prepare me completely for this experience, I just, through getting people's personal stories, I hope to sort of begin to get an idea of what I could expect when it happened to me.
You're doing what we used to, in graduate school we used to call having that tremendous intellectual curiosity. On the one hand, you can go to a funeral and you wear black, and there's a priest, a minister, a rabbi, or a shaman, and you say this is the way things are done, and you go home and okay. But you're saying to yourself, why are we doing it this way? Why does Oakland Cemetery have those giant mausoleums, and why do some people have a little stone in the ground? So am I right about that? You're just curious.
Yeah, exactly.
So to give the people a taste of this book, let's try to get through the 8 chapters, and I'll call them 12 vignettes of death. It begins with you going to the Museum of Funeral Customs.
Yes. This place was so cool.
What kind of museum?
It was one of the coolest museums I've ever been to in my life. Rest in peace. It is no longer around. It was in Springfield, Illinois. The Museum of Funeral Customs was run by this guy, John Austin, who was a museum curator. And he told me, when I finished making my way, this is in the book, but when I finished making my way through the museum, it takes most people 30, 45 minutes to make their way around this museum that showcases Victorian death customs and things like embalming tables and hearses and antique.
But you love this stuff, and you say you love tours and guided.
So much. I mean, I'm a nerd. I am. No. So it did not take me 45 minutes. It took me 3 hours.
Wow.
To go through the Museum of Funeral Customs, just poring over every detail in there.
And there are reasons for everything. And one of the is that where you discovered haircraft?
It is where I saw a great deal of haircraft on display. So, I mean, basically the story of haircraft.
There's someone out there in the audience going, wait a second, what's haircraft?
Yeah, what's haircraft, right?
Kate, what's haircraft?
Okay. So back in the 1800s.
We can smile about this, but it's serious business.
We can. Back in the 1800s, people enjoyed giving each other keepsakes of locks of hair. This was the Romantic era, and this is what people did.
The golden age of death, as you characterize it.
It was also the golden age of death. And so once your loved one had died, and people were losing loved ones at a much more rapid rate than we are today, it's fair to say, right? You had this sort of ready-made relic of the person you had lost, and you would hold on to that, and that would mean something to you. And a lot of people would make jewelry out of these locks of human hair. And the thing, though, is that this jewelry would get really ornate. People would make necklaces, earrings. In the Museum of Funeral Customs, I saw a tiara. I saw a wreath of human hair above a fireplace. I saw a watch fob, and I looked at it and I said, where's the hair? It said watch fob, materials, human hair, the year, the person it was donated by. And then all at once I realized, oh my goodness, the whole thing is made of human hair, tiny little intricate braids. And so, I mean, this was a really visceral way of people keeping their loved ones close.
But if I read the book correct, it's your book and it's wonderful, but you call it the golden age of death because this was a civilized approach for one of the first times, and the Egyptians did it, the Greeks did it, the Romans did it, but there are times when people forgot how to take care of their dead ones. The 19th century was a codification, a formalization of death customs and in our culture. Am I correct about that?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this was a time when
you could only wear black for like 15 days, and the cut of your hem was a certain...
Absolutely, absolutely. There were rules governing mourning, no matter your relationship to the dead, and no matter sort of who you were. And so if you were, say, a widow, your mourning period would last for like a couple of years. And there were rules, there were stages of mourning, and rules for what you could do in every single one of those stages. This was also the time in which the cemetery, as we know it, was invented. Before then, there were graveyards, but graveyards were not places that people went to visit for fun. They were places you buried bodies and then you got the heck out of there, right? But this was the age of, think of like the Romantic poets, they're walking around the cemeteries and
Elegy by a Graveyard by Thomas Gray, I think, or that famous one.
Wordsworth with his, missed his crowded obelisks and urns walking through the cemetery. And so this was the time when people people would go to cemeteries and have picnics. They would plant gardens on their loved ones' gravestones. Cemeteries meant a lot to people. It was also the era that invented the deathbed scene.
Oh, God. One of the greatest ones was, and you even talk about it in Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah. Little Ava, and she says something like, I must die now, but before I do, I want to talk to you about your souls.
Kate, this is personal to me because I'm starting to read obituaries now. And you read so many obituaries that the deceased passes away surrounded by his or her loved ones. I've seen death in my family. It doesn't happen that way. Mom's dead, that kind of stuff.
You get a phone call or something like that.
Right.
Things have really changed, but I mean, as you point out, and I think it's a really good point to make, the way that change has taken place. In the 1800s, people really valued, as you say, dying at home, surrounded by loved ones, and this was called the good death. And it actually came from evangelical Christianity. So a third tenet there was that you would be saved before you died. But folks sort of, no matter, how they worshipped, really valued this idea of the good death, dying surrounded by loved ones at home. This is one reason the Civil War was so catastrophic to people, because suddenly people were dying far from home and under what circumstances?
400,000 deaths, and suddenly, towns in Maine and Mississippi are depleted of their young men, and cartloads of bodies are coming back. Embalming was invented practically.
Exactly. And
all in this book.
And a big reason for that was because people wanted to see the state of their loved ones. So then around the turn of the 20th century, you do have this change. You have the rise of germ theory, the rise of institutions like hospitals. Suddenly, as you say, people are dying, not at home, surrounded by professionals who it's their job to take care of the folks who are dying rather than loved ones. You have physicians, and you have the rise of the funeral home. So death itself isn't taking place at home anymore either.
We're only about 25 pages into the book, so I'm going to be the arbiter of this, okay?
Please do.
So the next chapter is, wait a second.
It's a lot of stuff.
is Sarah Peacock, who is an English woman.
Yes.
Let me give you my example. This is me with Sarah Peacock. I've just lost my brother, who has tattoos all over his body. He's a biker on the West Coast. And I go into her place, and she will tattoo an image of my brother on my chest if I want it.
Yes.
She does this for a living. Part of it. I can't. Did I say that the right way? Well, she tattoos images of the deceased.
Yes. Well,
as we speak.
As we speak, she's doing this. She is.
You walked into her shop.
I did walk into her shop.
I love this
She's
book.
a great lady.
Yeah.
Basically, she specializes in realistic portraiture. So, I mean, the living, the dead, whoever. But because of that, a lot of people who have lost people and want sort of realistic images of their dead come to her. But I learned something else really neat that sort of has an historic parallel when I talked with Sarah, is there is a biker tattoo that is traditional among bikers of getting a graveyard emblazoned, say, across your chest. Or on your back, and it'll have the gravestones, but they're not filled in yet. And then as each of your biker buddies motors up to that bike rally in the sky, you get his or her name then tattooed onto the gravestone. Well, back in colonial times, there was such a thing as a graveyard quilt, in which people, like, it looked like a graveyard, and then these tombstones would be sewn along the border of the quilt. On each one would have the name of a family member, and when that person died, that tombstone would be moved to the center of the quilt in the little gated area that was the graveyard of the quilt. And so I saw these tombstone, these biker tattoos, and later on I was reading about these colonial quilts, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's this weird parallel. Who would have expected that? The biker guys and these, colonial ladies have something in common.
I'm going to take a chance and see if I really understand the theme of your book. Your theme is not so much an exposition of American funeral customs. It's about how we memorialize the dead. Do I get that right? And
yes.
There's a difference, I think, between funeral customs and your book is about attempts to memorialize loved ones.
Yeah.
Do I get that right? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's not an academic work.
Right.
It's I'm not an academic, and I make sure that I
You're
say
close.
that
You're
front
close.
and center.
A lot of research.
I'm a journalist, and
Yeah.
I did lots of research.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of an explorer in this world.
Okay.
So I researched a lot about how Americans memorialize our dead, and got the stories of people who had these experiences, or who shepherd people through these experiences, in hopes of finding out a little bit about what we need from this experience, and also about what do we do as a nation to memorialize our dead, and why, and what has changed there, and a lot has changed.
One of my favorite chapters is about Atlanta's own Oakland Cemetery. If you are a scholar of death cemeteries, graveyards, and funereal customs, you would be attracted to Oakland Cemetery because it's one of the most confused, messiest, greatest cemeteries on earth. Am I right? You say that.
Well, I went to Oakland
Yeah.
hoping to sort of
I've visited. It's like people are having picnics. There are funerals. There are trees down. We'll talk about that.
Last time I went to Oakland, and it was to do a reading.
Right here in town.
Yeah, there were 2 weddings taking place that
Okay.
day. There was a beer tour. There was my reading. There were tourists everywhere. It's a very lively place, and it's sort of lively in the sense, it made me think of the days of the Victorians and how they would picnic on the grounds of a cemetery. And yes, it was a site for mourning and for grief, absolutely. But it was also a place for living.
But when you're driving down DeKalb Avenue and you see like a mausoleum with a spire that's 25 feet, there's a reason for that. And I've read the book, so someone is showing off, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yes, as you walk by, there's especially this one section of Oakland sort of near the corner of Boulevard and Memorial Drives, and you see these sort of almost like competing spires, as you mentioned, and a lot of these were built by sort of Atlanta's, I guess you'd say, founding fathers, or sort of founding industrialist families. And the idea was almost as if they were vying to show that they were more powerful and more influential. And so you see, these obelisks, and they have, they're tall and they're towering. There's one that looks like it's an Egyptian style made by the Kuntz family. And it really is. It is like a lesson in Atlanta's history, just walking through.
Who maintains Oakland? It's in the book, but I want you to tell the folks out there.
Oakland is maintained by the Historic Oakland Foundation.
It's not the city of Atlanta. It's not Fulton County.
Not. They are run on volunteer power.
It's incredible.
And interestingly enough, the storm, the great sort of tornado that rolled through town a few years ago, did a lot of damage to Oakland, but also did a lot in terms of raising awareness about this great resource in our city, and has brought a lot of attention and focus to it. And I think they're actually doing pretty well, which is nice. Thing.
You have a great chapter on Atlanta's own Kay Powell.
Yeah.
And I would characterize her as one of the last of the great obituary writers. This was a profession, and you've made me so sensitized to reading obituaries now. I look, like in the AJC, it's like written especially for the AJC, so that's a freelancer writing an obituary. But Kay Powell was employed full-time, as many were in American newspapers. What were you call her the doyenne of the death beat. What was that like meeting? Didn't you meet her at like a cafe and she's smoking cigarettes and she's heavy voice and
There is nothing like meeting Kay Powell,
I love this
because
book.
she is a firecracker of a personality, and I'm going to say she's one of my favorite people walking this earth, because she wrote about the dead, but she's a Southern lady, and I would love to be able to talk. She has a low, gravelly voice and this wonderful Georgia accent, and she's so charming, but she's also very exacting. She is a journalist through and through, and so most important to her when getting the stories of the dead was making sure they were accurate. So she, like many professional journalists who wrote obituaries, and some still do across the country, would go in the morning from knowing somebody's name, knowing their cause of death and their birth and death dates, until 4 p.m. that day, her deadline, having to have sort of a fully fleshed out story of that person's life. And for the reader to be able to read it and feel like, oh, I know that person now. Yeah. And for it to be absolutely accurate. And
you can't make retractions. We made a mistake in that obituary yesterday. You can't do that.
No. And she's someone that who knows, but I would be proud to have her write my obituary, because there's nothing's going to be inaccurate in there. And if you ever get the chance to read any of her obituaries, I would absolutely recommend it, because she's an entertaining writer.
I did go back and read about some people I know, believe it or not. I'm going to skip ahead because one of my favorite chapters is about a traditional funeral director, Dan Wilkerson, near Wilmington, or
Don Wilkerson.
Don Wilkerson, I'm sorry. And I was really surprised at how forthcoming he was in sharing information, because most of us who have been to funerals, they're impenetrable with their dignity. I'm talking about the funeral directors. And yes, dearly beloved, and blah, blah, blah. We've all experienced that, except you. No, I'm just kidding. But what was he like? I mean, he showed you the traditional. This is when someone dies and you go to the funeral director and you're bereaved, you're crying, and he says, well, I'll show you the best casket we have if you care. The whole business,
And dealt with it every day of his life, right? He was a third-generation funeral director at Wilkerson and Sons Funeral Home in Greenville,
they're all third generation, aren't
they? And he told me stories about, Greenville, North Carolina is a small town, eastern North Carolina, and he told me stories about, up until the 1970s, his family would sort of, they'd walk you around and then write up your invoice on the side of a casket that just sort of propped up against the wall, and write it up, and then they would bill you once a year, just when because it was a farming community, there's sort of once a year when sort of the money comes in for farmers, and that's when you would get billed for everything, because it's a small town, including your funeral. And you say he was lively, and I think that's why I included him in the book, because we have this image, this stereotype of the funeral director being, as you say, impenetrable and maybe also socially awkward. We think of the term mortician. When I think of the term mortician, I think of Morticia Addams from the Addams Family. I think of somebody who's probably going to be maybe even a little bit creepy. And Don Wilkerson was anything but. It was his job to connect with people in the community and to gain their trust.
Wow.
And I could almost feel him kind of doing that with me while we're having the interview. He's asking after my grandmama and how's she doing, and telling me about the great Thai restaurant in Chapel Hill. And
we're not even halfway through the book, but we're not going to talk about cremation right now. But all these chapters are wonderful. There are 8 chapters and 12 vignettes. But give me that old-time green burial. You
Sure.
talked to the managers of Ramsey Creek Preserve in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And
Or South Carolina,
it's
yeah.
like a land trust where, if I get this right, and you were there, you walk out with the deceased, the body, and it's put in a hole, and maybe a shrub or a tree is put over it. No preservatives, no embalming fluid, and the green funeral means it's part of, the body becomes part of nature.
Right.
Do
I mean, the way that like our great...
Why does that send shivers up and down my spine? But it's so beautiful.
It might, but I mean, think about it. This is likely the way that a lot of our great-grandparents did it.
The body's not shrouded. You see the body.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, someone dies, you have the funeral maybe in the home, and the individual is buried at that point probably maybe on your property or in the churchyard, but I mean, there's no embalming. So yeah, Ramsey Creek Preserve is the nation's very first green burial cemetery, but this is a trend in this country. When I first started following green burial in 2007, there were 4 green burial cemeteries in this country. In 2013, when I called up the Green Burial Council to sort of fact check how many green burial cemeteries are there were 40.
That's incredible.
40, including one right outside of Atlanta in Conyers, run by the Monastery
but
of the Holy
makes
Spirit.
sense. It makes sense. So like the fishes. Okay, you're in Charleston. You go out with a party of bereaved people who are about to bury their loved ones in something called, vaguely obscene, but they're reef balls.
Reef balls.
And these balls contain the ashes of the dead, and they are sunk into the sea and eventually create a reef.
Yes, and they work.
And you got seasick.
I did. To be fair, I wasn't the only one who got seasick on that trip, but who did I ever get seasick? So yeah, I mean, this chapter investigates.
I love that chapter.
Everything that we're doing with ashes today, which are so many things, and I think part of that has to do with the baby boomer generation. You know what? Coming of age and looking at, okay, maybe this is how my parents experienced this, or how I experienced the loss of my parents. This is the way that went down. Now, when it happens to me, I want control over the situation. And so, you know, we're seeing the rise of things like hospice care and lots of different options when it comes to memorialization, including a lot of different options when it comes to cremation.
I must say this. We're going to bury this interview. No, we've come to the end of this interview. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been talking to a wonderful author, Kate Sweeney. She's the author of American Afterlife, Encounters in the Customs of Mourning. Kate Sweeney is a wonderful, entertaining, instructive, and beautiful writer. I was going to say beautifully written, but so what? And it's about what we do at the end of other people's lives. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, James, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
That was quick. Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed.